Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
I'm Michael Noll. I'm the program director for the Writers League of Texas. This is WLT on the Craft of Writing with David Treuer. Best-selling author David Treuer is an Ojibwe Indian from Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. His father was an Austrian Jew and Holocaust survivor, and his mother was a tribal court judge. Treuer is the author of 4 novels, a memoir, a book of literary criticism, and most recently, the acclaimed hybrid of nonfiction memoir and reportage, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. He is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize, 2 Minnesota Book Awards, fellowships from the NEH Bush Foundation and the Guggenheim Foundation. He divides his time between his home on the Leech Lake Reservation and Los Angeles, where he is a professor of English at USC. I've read a lot of David's work. I first encountered, or the first book that I read was his book of literary criticism, Native American Fiction, A Reader's Guide. And you know how you have that feeling when you read a book and it's so good that you can't stop talking about it, and you tell everybody about it, and they're like, yes, you've already told me about this book. And you're quoting it to them anyway, and I taught from it. And it was a thrilling piece of writing, which is not how I often feel about literary criticism. Thrilling is not usually the adjective I would come up with. But it's a wonderful book. So I've read a lot of his work. He is a terrific writer, a really keen critic, and a really essential historian. So please join me in welcoming David Treuer.
Thanks, man.
Oh, it's yours.
Hey, Texas. So I guess this is where I just tell you how I did it. It's exciting to have a chance to talk about how we do this stuff, to how we make these books. I have students, and I tell my students all the time, I tell them over and over again, as literature students, but also as creative writing students, that books are not found things, they're made things. This is really hard for students of literature to accept, right? Because they open a book and it just seems like it's a thing that they found. And they forget that many choices went into the making of it. The writer made decision after decision, word upon word. Those words were chosen, sometimes unconsciously, to be sure, but sometimes with purpose. And so it's really fun to have a chance to stray a little bit away from the substance of the book, which is what most people most often want to talk about, and to talk about the creative decisions that went into making it. But to do that, I think I have to do a little bit of storytelling just about myself and my journey into writing nonfiction at all. So to make a fairly long story somewhat short, and I know we have 20 minutes for this first part, Michael. Okay, well, I'll try. If you knew my father, you'd know that it's not going to be easy, to keep it brief. I had never had any ambition to write nonfiction, ever. When I was coming up as a young writer, I wanted to be a novelist. I didn't even want to write short stories. Novels were where it's at. John F. Kennedy said about the presidency, he wanted the presidency because that's where the power was. And I felt the same way about writing fiction. Novels in particular, that's where the power is. In my stupid 19-year-old head, that's what I thought. And I was content to be a professional liar, which is what novelists are. It's not, as E.M. Forster put it, it's the trick isn't to encourage your readers to engage in the willing suspension of disbelief. I think the opposite is actually true. The trick is to get your readers to believe in things that never existed. It's not the suspension of disbelief, it's the creation of belief. And to do that, we lie as novelists. And I was happy to do that. But then some things transpired pretty close to my heart and close to home that sort of urged me out of this narrow channel that I made for myself. One thing that happened was that there was a school shooting on the Red Lake Reservation in 2005, which is just up the road from my reservation. And I used to work for the school district, and my father used to be a teacher in that school, and the reservation is just closely tied to mine, and our family is closely tied to many families there. And so it was painful, and it was shocking. And in the aftermath of the shooting, there was a lot of media coverage, and the media coverage was all of a kind. On a poor remote reservation, tragedy strikes. That was the headline. That was the story they were telling. And I was really frustrated, and I was really upset, livid, that in this place that I loved, full of people whom I love, I couldn't get any information about what happened. All I got in the media was the same old sad story about reservations as places of suffering, as places in America but not of it. And I was complaining to friends. I said, when Columbine happened, people didn't say, on a largely affluent, super Anglo, right? They didn't say that. They didn't talk about race. They didn't talk about class. They just talked about what happened. You actually got the news. As it turns out, of course, much of it falsely reported. But there was an attempt anyway. But at Red Lake, no. You just got the same old story about Indians. And I was frustrated, and so I was talking to an editor, and I said, someone, that's not the story of reservations. That's not the story of this place I'm from. That's, we love these places not because they suck. It seems stupid to say, but it's true. We love these places because they're interesting, they're vibrant, there's a lot going on there. And he said, well, what's the story then if it's not that? If it's not a story of tragedy, what's the story? And I said, well, I don't know, but it's not that. And he said, well, I've always wanted to publish a book on the subject, on reservations and what they are and what they mean and where they're going. Who writes nonfiction? What native writers write nonfiction? And so that's when I lied. And I just said, I'm about the only one. And he said, well, maybe you should write this book. I said, well, I mean, if I'm called to do it, I'm called to do it. And no, really, I did lie to him. I'd never written nonfiction in my life. And I thought it was going to be easy, right? I thought it was going to be simple. And so I wrote the book. I spent a couple of years, and I wrote the book, and I handed it in, and he rejected it. He said, yeah, so you need to start over. I said, well, by starting over, you mean there's some good parts and there's some bad parts. And he just he's like, if you were listening, that's not what I said. What I said is, we're not going to publish this. And if you give this to us again, we're going to cancel your contract. And he was right, because it's one thing to know what you don't want to do. And I knew the story I didn't want to tell, but it's a whole other thing to know what you actually want to do. And I didn't know, and I didn't know how to do it. Writing nonfiction was much more difficult than I anticipated. Then some other things transpired. And the point of all of this is a craft point, in a way, even though this is a really specific story about how I came to nonfiction and with this particular project. But some other stuff happened even closer to home. My grandfather committed suicide. And that's a separate story, which we don't have time for, but which is in my book, Res Life. And in the experience of his suicide and his funeral, and I had to write his eulogy. I was asked by my grandmother to write his eulogy, and I was wondering what I should say about him. I was hurt, and I was lost, and I was upset. I was grieving. And it would have been so easy for me to just grab onto that and kind of swim in it. That was my temptation. But I thought, well, eulogies have to do two things. You have to say something true of the deceased, and you have to say something that is of some use to the living, because that's who the eulogy is actually for. And so it was tempting to sort of just amplify in my eulogy the pain I was feeling at the loss of my grandfather, but was that accurate? Was that an accurate thing to say about him? And I thought, well, he lived 83 years. Why should I define those 83 years by what happened by the time, basically, the split second that bullet existed inside of his head? Like, why should that weigh more than the life he lived? That wouldn't be accurate. It also wouldn't be fair. And so I was thinking about his life, and I thought, well, he had a hard life, my grandfather, in a lot of ways, but he got to live 80 of his 83 years in the only place that mattered to him, Bena, Minnesota, surrounded by the only people that he loved, the only people in this world he cared about, and he saw them every single day of his life. The only time he missed 3 years of that when he was in Europe killing Germans, but other than that doesn't seem like bad luck. That seems like good fortune. And so I started to think about him differently as I was trying to eulogize him. And then by extension, I began to think about my community differently. So I thought about my grandfather as living this life of surplus rather than deficit. Surplus pain, okay, but surplus good fortune. And then sort of this idea of surplus grew, and I started thinking about this place that I was from as a place of surplus. Surplus poverty, but surplus hustle. Surplus crime, but surplus laws. More of everything, not less, you know? And so that was the key to unlocking this first project. And so I rewrote the book, and he didn't reject it, and it got published, and I started in this, what was originally a side hustle, I guess, of writing nonfiction. And the craft point, I guess, is this, that your style, your structure, the artistic sense of the book, at least for me, always flows from the subject. The style has to match the subject. It can't be applied to a subject. So in the writing of Res Life, I knew what the story was finally. It was a story of surplus, of a kind of plenty. And I had to structure and style the book in a way that reflected the values of that book. And that was actually what saved me from writing a second horrible book that was going to get rejected. And that sensibility, it sort of flowed through into the book in question, which is this new one, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. I knew that I wanted my book to be a follow-up and counter-narrative to D. Brown's 1970 classic, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, in which, on the first page of which he says, this book is about the Plains Wars. It starts in 1850 and it ended at the massacre at Wounded Knee, where, quote, the culture and civilization of the American Indian was destroyed, end quote. And he continues on page 2, and he says, so if you happen to travel to a contemporary reservation and notice the poverty and the hopelessness and the squalor, perhaps by reading my book you will understand why. And I'm like, f*** you, man. I read that book when I was 20, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I knew even then, although it took me I'm not going to tell you, but over 20 years to get to writing a follow-up, but I knew him to be wrong, that 1890 was not the end of us. I knew this. I felt this. I lived this. 1890 might have been a low point, but it was a point from which Native communities have been moving, succeeding creatively, intelligently, in all sorts of ways. So I wanted to write a follow-up and counter-narrative to D. Brown's book, and I wanted to start in 1890, and I wanted to have the opposite thesis in tow, which is that 1890 was not the end. It was a low point, but one from which we've emerged in many ways. So I knew what I wanted to do, and so the structure of the book, right, the craft sense of the book, I knew needed to be threefold. Since this was a book about since it was a counter-narrative and a follow-up, I had to go back into the written record. There had to be a fair amount of history in the book. I had to go back into the written record and find things or amplify things that either hadn't been found or were too quiet. So that was one thing that the book had to do. But also, since the book was fundamentally about American Indian life as opposed to American Indian death, I absolutely had to go out and talk to people. One of the big points of the book is drawing our attention to the ways in which Native people we've been actors in our own lives. Karl Marx says in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which I'm sure is on the top of everybody's stack right next to their beds, he says something to the effect of, all men make history, they just don't always make it as they please. They don't always make it with tools of their choosing, but they make it nonetheless. And that was something that occurred to me in thinking about my own people. We're often treated as being only victims of history. We're used to thinking of Native American history as just a laundry list of things that has been done to us, but that is not true. We have been, if we think about our Karl Marx, making our own history, not always with tools of our choosing, not always as we please, but we have been historical actors in our own lives. And as part of that, the history that we have made and participated in flows through us. History is not past, right? Was it Faulkner that said the past is hardly past at all? It exists in us. It lives through us. And so to capture it, I had to talk to living people. So that meant the book had to be part writing about the historical record, and it had to be part me going out and interviewing and talking to people. And this was something that evolved from Res Life, to go back to that first book of nonfiction, which was also a blend of history, reportage, and memoir. When I handed in that second draft to my editor, he said, this is much better, it's much better, but there's all this personal stuff in there, like this memoir stuff. We need to take that out. I said, excuse me? And he said, yeah, we're going to take that out. I said, okay. Why? He says, well, we wanted to write a book of history. We wanted a history book. We didn't want a memoir. I said, well, let me tell you what you don't know. What you don't know is that when anyone picks up a book about a native subject, their very first question, either to themselves or outwardly, is, who the hell is this guy? And what the hell does he know? And what gives him the right? That's the first thing I think, who's this guy? Is he legit or not? It's a fair question because native people have been screwed over in print for so many centuries. We are particularly sensitive to questions of representation. So I said, you don't know this, but I do. So I have to show them who I am. And so I'm a part of this. I said, furthermore, and you also don't know this, it's like I talked to a lot of people and they were really generous with their time and they trusted me. I went to their homes and I talked to them and they shared their lives with me. I asked them to put themselves on the line and to trust me with their stories in print. And it's really, really uncool where I'm from to ask someone to do something that you're unwilling to do yourself. So I can't politically, or I guess culturally, but it's more socially, I can't do that. If they're gonna risk something, I'm gonna risk something. If they're gonna tell me things about their lives, I've gotta do the same thing. I'm not gonna hang them out there. So I have to be in it. And if that means you cancel the contract, I'm like, knock yourself out. I'll take it someplace else. He's like, okay, we'll do it. So that's also true for the Heartbeat. If I was gonna ask people to talk about themselves, I had to entail the same risk. I had to, I couldn't hide behind the prose. And so all these different values that went into making the book, all of my agenda, why I wanted to write the book, how I wanted the book to function in relation to sort of the other books that preceded it, like D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, meant that this book had to have this 3-part shape. History, reportage, memoir. In that order, by the way. There's not a whole lot of me in there. That was really important. In terms of crafting it, just some advice to writers. Do not decide to write a book this ambitious and then immediately get involved in getting divorced. It's a really time-consuming thing, it turns out. Divorce takes a lot of energy. No one told me that, So I was late. I was very late, and I kept delaying, and I hadn't written anything. A couple years went by, and my editor said, well, we don't want your fastest work, we want your best work, but we actually want your work, so. But she gave me some room, and then when I sat down to write it, this is the sort of the non-jokey part, like, it went quickly once I sat down to write it. It's 511 pages long, but those pages are sort of, ethereal. They just sort of flow around you. It's like, it's really not labor to read it, is what I'm saying. It's just, don't be scared, is what I'm saying. I'm saying buy the book, is what I'm saying. But I think it has 7 sections, maybe it's 8 sections. And just the practicalities of writing the book, like once I figured out the people are at the center of each section. When I figured out which person I had interviewed was gonna work for which section, like once I understood the people I talked to and I knew where they were gonna go in the book, the rest of the chapters, those sections grew around the testimony of the people that I interviewed for the book. I knew where to put the history. I knew where to put myself. And so that sort of their stories of themselves, this old guy from Blackfeet country, my cousin Sam, who's an MMA fighter, this woman from Fond du Lac Reservation in Minnesota who's become an ultra marathon runner. Once I knew I talked to them and I could see sort of the parts of the history that I was interested in, and I saw how it worked in relation to them, how it informed their lives. Then I knew how each section was going to go, and I knew what to put around it to support it. And so the writing went really quickly because I had the architecture. I'm not an outliner. I don't take notes, mostly because I can't read my own handwriting. Ask my brother. He can't read it either. So no one can read my handwriting. So it's all internal, but once I have the structure, I'm a structural writer. Once I have a structure, I can build everything around that, right? And that's just how it goes for me. So once I had the people, and they're really the structure of this book about Indian life and lives. Like once that was in place, It was kind of gravy, and I wrote like the wind. I just locked myself in this house in New Mexico and wrote like 100,000 pages in 4 months while still eating and going to yoga. And jujitsu. Actually, jujitsu is the best thing for writing. I think Brazilian jiu-jitsu. A really aggressive form of meditation. There's no past, there's no future, there's just the person who's trying to submit you. Might as well focus on that. Anyway, it really did help me.
Yeah, I thought we could just talk a little bit of craft. And so I was dog-earing pages as I read your book. And actually, I want to start at the end because you have a note on sources.
Right.
You say basically there's no composite characters, there's no pseudonyms, all the dialogue in quotation marks was recorded digitally. Reconstructed dialogue appears in italics. You tried to avoid the he must have style, he must have felt, and so on. And I thought of that too, like when you were talking about knowing the story you didn't want to tell, but not sure the story that you wanted to tell.
Right.
You know, because one of the risks of like the he must have style is that you're just basically telling your own story through their character.
Yeah.
And so I guess I wondered about some of like the ethical or the professional choices you made in terms of presenting people's words and the images of themselves.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And there's in the field of creative nonfiction, which I guess this would fall under, there is no consensus. Some writers like John DeGotta said that fact is something that you play with, and it's not that different from fiction, and he's not necessarily responsible to his sources. And I don't agree with him at all. But there's this, some people foreground the creative aspects of nonfiction, making composite characters, changing names, changing events, reconstructing dialogue, putting it in quotes as though that's how it was actually said, even though it was said by someone and you weren't there to hear it, or someone who's long dead or whatever. And that's fine, I guess. But again, for my subject, I really needed to winnow the sort of opinion from fact, and I needed to present them as such. We have been misconstrued and used and fantasized about and mythologized and essentialized for so long, Native people, that is. I was not going to be party to that. So it's, given my subject, I had to be very clear. If it's in quotes, and I say this at the end in the part that Michael mentioned, it's because I've got a recording of it. And if it's in italics, that's dialogue I'm remembering. And I refrain from doing this thing. And Barbara Tuchman, right? She wrote The Guns of August, Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the First World War. She's the one who brings up this idea of the sort of must-have, could-have history. She's like, you will find in these pages, she says something effective, you won't find in these pages the kind of loose history in which the historian says, Napoleon must have felt, concerned as he gazed out over she's like, that's not going to happen here. Observations on the weather and on the emotions of the players in this history are only mentioned if there's documentary evidence to support them, for example. And I thought that's a very good way to do this business for me. But I took it a step further in terms of how I interacted with people when I recorded them. It's funny, like outsiders, like, how do you get access to, like, how do you get Indian people to talk to you? I'm like, I don't know, because I'm Indian too, But I'm also not an asshole. So there's that. But there's also this. So when I was talking to people, this is what I told them. I said, hey, look, guys. And this was especially true when they're people I'm close to. So in res life, there's a guy I talked to named Sean Farlander. He's passed away, but he was a character. He's one of my best friends. And when I said, I want to interview you for this book, man, he's like, cool, man, I'll talk to you. I'm like, okay, here's what's going to happen, though. And here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to pick you up at your house, and I'm going to have a thermos full of coffee, the way you like it, and we're going to go driving around hunting partridge. That's what we're going to do. We're going to shoot grouse. And I'm going to put a lapel mic on you, turn on my recorder, and we're just going to talk all day long. And you're going to forget. It's on you. You're going to say some awful things. You will. He's a sailor. He speaks like a sailor. Spoke like a sailor. He's like, whatever, man. I'm like, no, but here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take this recording. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to, at some point, probably use it in the book. I don't know how. And when I do write the chapter in which you appear, I will do this for you. I will send the chapter to you. You can read the chapter. You can do one or all three things. You can correct errors of fact. If I get names wrong, dates wrong, ages, siblings, all that kind of stuff, and I get those things wrong. You can correct errors of fact. You can rephrase things that you wished you'd said differently because you got carried away and you want to take it back. You can do that. You can do do-overs. And if you read the whole thing and don't like how you're being situated in relation to the whole chapter, you can just opt out. You can say, you know what, I'm out. I don't want to be in this anymore, and I will rewrite the chapter without you in it. He's like, okay, man, cool, all right. And so when the book comes out, well, when I finish the chapter, I send it to him. He's like, yeah, man, I don't know, dude. Like, it's pretty rough. Like, you know, like, I don't know if, I'm like, what did your mom say? He's like, my mom said you got me perfect. And I was like, because there's this one part in this chapter where I'm asking him about treaty rights. I'm like, Sean, why do you practice your treaty rights? And he's like, let me answer your question with another question. Sorry, kids. Why does a dog lick its own And I'm like, oh, that's definitely going in the book, you know? And he's like, I mean, I don't know, maybe you could change that. Like, or he's like, never mind, I don't have anything to hide. It's cool, it's fine. And I was like, you sure? Because, I mean, and remember that you have a lot to hide. I mean, you do. I know all your crime. I know you. And I just want you to remember that I didn't put most of that in the book. And he's like, that's fair. You know, and so that's one thing that made my process different, because what I did was very unlike the standard journalistic process, you know, where once it's on the record, and the journalists can do with it what they will. That didn't feel fair. You can't, I couldn't work in, I have to live with these people, you know? Not literally necessarily, because I was talking to people across the country, but these are my people. I have relationships with them, with their communities. And so I can't sell them out. I can't misconstrue them. I can't use them, you know? That was really important. And I can't I can't work in a community, which is, by extension, my community, but a community that has been underserved and misconstrued and in many ways diminished by the world around it. And I can't go there and do more damage. That's just not being a good human being, right? You can't go into a community which has many struggles and has sort of suffered in many different ways, and then pile it on by then exploiting people. So that determines sort of the kind of rigidity of how I approach that stuff.
When you were, we were talking earlier about a Pueblo guy that you were interviewing, and you were asking him questions about government. Yeah. And there were things that he was not going to share with you because it's sort of a members only information, right. And yet you needed to kind of bump up against it in order to like convey certain parts of the story and the information. How did you negotiate that in terms of things of like, these are things appropriate for a book for the common reader, and these are the things that are not so much?
I let him make that decision because I'm not Pueblo. So basically I was trying to understand how Pueblo government worked. And I read all the books and I'm like, I still don't get it because all the books had different things. It was just baffling to me. And you know, and that's the fact of life, right? I'm Ojibwe from a tribe in Minnesota, and like what we do, we're not really at all like Pueblo people. We're really different, you know? We're as like Pueblo people as sort of Sicilians are to Finns, both in Europe, but pretty different. And so how could I even make a determination what's appropriate? But he had to. So when I talked to him, I'm like, Brian, and this guy was like, and he'd served as lieutenant governor of Acoma Pueblo, and I was like, Brian, a young guy. I'm like, Brian, so like, I don't know how your government works, and I kind of want to know. I know that, you know, being Pueblo is kind of like being in Fight Club. I get it. You know, the first rule of Pueblo Club is you don't talk about Pueblo Club. And I respect that. I don't want secrets. What can you tell me about how the government works? He's like, well, I can tell you some things. Like, we can talk. And so we did. And then, I don't know, I think he trusted me. And then he got to see the chapter, and he got to read it and vet it. But he's a really brilliant man who knows what the appropriate limits are for him. So he was really good at not stepping over those. So he's like, then one part of his testimony, within our conversation, he's like, so at one point there was some directives from some beings to do a thing. And then we went to a place. I'm just like, this is just awesome. And then some more things transpired. And so he was very good at glossing over, and then he also had a chance to read it again, you know, and determine. And I don't remember him taking anything out, so I think he and I together sort of were able to he knew the score. And he also knew me, you know. He'd read Res Life, and he knew my work, and he knew me socially too, so that helped. You know, and we had his work at Acoma, not that I know it well, is not unlike the kind of work that my older brother does. And so I also know how to talk with people with those kinds of jobs, you know, these kinds of ceremonial jobs where I'm not someone for whom he's working.
Right.
You know, but.
You know, what about, you mentioned this earlier, you know, if somebody that you were interviewing was uncomfortable with the context that their story was put in, And I thought about this, in particular with your cousin. But I mean,
Sam?
But you talk to your mother, and any of the individuals in the book. Was there ever a tension between like their individual story and the larger historical narrative that you're telling? Because at any point when you begin to identify different individuals, they're going to start to carry some of the weight of like, this is what it means to be, Native America from 1890 to the present.
Right.
How did you handle that?
They're going to see
tension?
themselves differently from the way that perhaps I'm framing or seeing them.
Yeah.
Framing their experiences or seeing them. Yeah, that happens all the time. No one came back feeling weird about that. So I don't feel like I got in trouble that way. Although I think I give a pretty honest assessment of, say, my cousin Sam, who's done some pretty awful things in his life. But he's also okay with, owning his mistakes, and he's not trying to hide them either. So he's that kind of person, But there's another guy who I didn't know well, another Blackfeet guy who his family relocated to Los Angeles, and he moved back, and he became a rodeo guy. I really liked him a lot. And in his piece, I characterize him at the end of that chapter as being incredibly sad, like full of a sorrow that he cannot shake. And I actually called his nephew, and I was like, how's your uncle going to feel about that? Like, I'm worried. Like, I really like your uncle. How do you think he's going to feel? And Sterling's like, he's a cowboy poet. Like, all they have are feelings. He's a Blackfeet cowboy poet. Like, he's got all the feelings in the world. He's like, he'll be fine. And I was like, all right. And then he read it, and he's like, he liked it. He didn't object, So I've been fortunate, I think, in the majority of the people that I've been lucky enough to talk to and work with. Is really how it feels when I'm writing this book. They sense that I have a certain, I have a huge amount of respect for them and their autonomy and their intelligence, and they offer that same respect back to me, is what it feels like. But you'd have to ask them, I guess, and they could probably answer that better than I could. But that's how it feels.
You mentioned luck. You also mentioned earlier that you're not an outliner.
Yeah.
How much of the shape of the book is the luck or the circumstances that led you to know like these people, and did you? There's hundreds of tribes, many people you could have spoken to. How did you begin to decide? All right, these are the people and the stories I'm gonna sort of build this around.
Well, I did a lot more. I conducted many more interviews and hung out with many more people than appear in the book. So there's a winnowing, Not everyone's a good talker. And there's this one guy, Red Hall, Blackfeet guy. He's 80-something, fiddle playing, ex-railroad working, ex-cowhand. And he's like, and I sat him down, and he's like, and he's like, so what do you want to know? I was like, well, I don't know. And he's like, well, and then there's this little back and forth, and it occurred to me that he was nervous, and he didn't know what was expected. And so there's a little kind of awkward back and forth for an hour or so until he finally is like, well, I'm not an expert in anything. Like, what do you want to, like, I'm pretty good, like, because I'm pretty good after 1934. Before that, not so good. So, what do you want to know? I'm like, I'm not an expert. And I said, Red, his name is Red Hall. I'm like, Red, like, I disagree. You are an expert in what it is to be an Indian man making his way in the 1940s and 50s. You are an expert in what it was like to try and make a living and raise a family and be a man in those years. I don't know what that was like. I wasn't even thought of yet. But you know what that was like. You're an expert in that. You're an expert in what it means to be you. And that's what I'm interested in. He's like, oh, and he was off and running. But yeah, they could probably tell you, better than I could. But in terms of like who wound up and knowing who to talk to, part of that is just, and maybe this is a disposition, I like to think I've always been pretty curious. I'm pretty interested in people. I like the stories that people tell. I think I'm pretty good at listening, unless it's like somebody who, like family, then I'm not so good, And I like the way people talk. I like the different things that occur to people that would never occur to me. So I'm always kind of like, I'm just into that stuff, And so that kind of creates a disposition that when I go out and just sort of chit-chat and meet people and I'm out and about in the world, and I'm like, oh yeah, that guy, I liked how he talked. Like, let me call him up and like, hey, do you think I could talk to you? Like that. I've always found, like, in this particular book, again, everything's different, but in in Native America, as it were, the people most willing to talk are the people with the least amount to say. We have a whole class of people that we refer to ourselves as professional Indians, whose job it is just to be like super Indian all the time. And they go to all the things being super Indian, and they usually look a certain way, you know? There's a look that goes with it. And they're always ready, you know, like, well, let me tell you, like in the traditions of my people, I'm like, you can stop, right? Because like let's face it, like in most movies, when a native character shows up, that's the first thing out of their mouth, you know? Whether it's in the show The Killing or it's in Wind River, you know? Well, in the traditions of my people, I'm like, oh God, like no one talks like that, you know? I kind of feel like that's what I should do. So go ahead, ask your next question. We'll see if I can make it work.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, so I had this sense when I was reading the book from the very beginning that the title says Native America from that it's a Native American history, but there's a large sense that this is an American history. And at the end, you kind of refer to that explicitly. You say you're writing about the Tulalip tribes of Washington, the social services they put in place, not just for themselves but for the larger community. And you say, this is Tulalip. This could also be America if only the country would pay attention. It seems antithetical, even nonsensical, to consider that in order to find America, you need to look at Indian communities and reservations, but it's true. The idea, you talked about this earlier, that reservations and Indians are outside of American history, that the history is something that happened to them, not that they're, a part of it, entwined. And I guess, was that something that you sort of consciously set out to do? How did you sort of create that sense? Because it's not the sense that is often the case when history is taught.
Well, I can do this. In the traditions of my people, we don't think of ourselves as being apart from creation. We're part of creation. Right? So we're a part of everything. It's like a medicine wheel. That was good, right? Thank you.
You just need the single tear coming down.
I'm working on. I mean, baby steps. Right? I just barely got the words out. The tears will come in San Antonio tomorrow. When I'm, That's a good title for a story. The tears will come in San Antonio. That's not really a craft question, right? I mean, that's just more of a substance question, which I'm happy to talk about. Like, there's this tendency for people to tune into Native stories as a kind of liberal social act, like volunteering at an after-school program. It's like, well, we took all this land. I should probably read this book,
By the way, buy the book.
By the way, that's not wrong. Buy the book, But there is this sort of urge to sort of think about us as as paying a penance, or to sort of massage one's guilt, or to feel this catharsis, and then, this unburdening of emotion and responsibility. And I don't think that's the best way to understand us. And I feel this is to be fundamentally true. And it's certainly one of the main points of the book, that you cannot, well, one, that's not the best way to think about us. It's also not the best way to think about the country, and I just feel this to be true. You cannot understand America unless you understand American Indian history. It is that simple. It's that simple. For the Boston Tea Party, when the colonists dumped tea in Boston Harbor, they didn't just dump tea in Boston Harbor, they also did what? Dressed up as Mohawk Indians to dump tea in Boston Harbor. So from America's first revolutionary act, it has been thinking about us. It has been defining itself, and it has been an ongoing experiment conducted in relation to us from that first moment till this one. The first test of states' rights versus federal power was not the question of slavery, was not the Civil War. It was the forced removal of Cherokee Indians and other civilized tribes from the Southeast United States in the early part of the 19th century. Georgia wanted the Indians gone. Andrew Jackson wanted to help Georgia. The Supreme Court sided with the tribes, said you can't move them, they're sovereign nations, the states have no power over tribes, and Andrew Jackson said, that's his decision, let's see him try to enforce it. I've got the army, and moved the tribes to what was then Indian territories in any event. So all these fundamental questions about the shape of the country. Oh, even to go back a little bit earlier, when after that revolution, after that, that sort of glorious dumping of tea and sort of some subsequent battles and so on, they were trying to think of what shape the American government should have, and where did they look? They looked to the Iroquois Confederacy. It is from them that this idea of the separation of powers was lifted. So from the beginning, America has made herself in relation to us, and in spite of us, in many instances, And so, and you really, America's character doesn't even come into focus unless you understand American Indian history and the ways in which it's enmeshed with American history. You can see the very worst things this country is capable of. You can see the expression of its most base instincts in its relationship, in its practice of dealing with Native people. And you can also see, the attempt to live by its noblest ideals as stated in its founding documents. You can see both. And you can't see both as clearly and as continuously except in relation to American Indian communities. So, I think it's worth more than simply trotting out some little turkey stuff around Thanksgiving and doing a little unit on, the Lakota once lived. The Lakota live still, right? So mind your tenses too, people. It's not just a past tense situation. The Ojibwe once were a woodland tribe. I'm like, as my kids would say, hey, asshat, we still are a woodland tribe. Benet, he says that all the time. He's a lisp, though. Hey, asshat. My 9-year-old. So yeah, I just take this to be true. And it's one of the big points of the book. And so this book was a way of trying to sort of show that, was trying to sort of live that out. And I think, when we don't do that, when we persist in thinking of Native communities as in America but not of it, as in Indian communities as just little basins of suffering or little islands of suffering in an American sea, well, then you don't really understand this, us, and you certainly don't understand this country, what it's capable of in both the best and worst ways.
A few minutes for questions from the audience. Yes.
All right. You said early on that you should match the style and craft to the
Sure.
subject matter. I assume
Right.
that is also for novels, not just for...
Yeah.
So then the other question is, how do you know you have the right style for the subject matter?
Right. It is true, at least for me, when I write novels too, that, I don't know, it makes me sad when writers just think that writing is a chance to have a glitter bomb word explosion, this is a chance for me to be a fancy man. When you write something, it's a chance to connect with someone, to move them, to get in their head, to change not just what they think, but how they think. That's the power of novels. And in some ways, the power of nonfiction, too. That's a little different, right? They sort of give us new eyes. Novels and nonfiction, again, to a lesser degree, are a chance to sort of connect with someone and get them to engage in an act of radical empathy. That's what it takes to care about characters who've never existed in a place you'll never go and do things you'll never do. It's radical empathy. I think that's also a civic virtue, or should be. But in order to do that, it's not just a question of showing off. It's not just sort of using all the fancy words that I have in my possession to let you know that I have those fancy words. It's a matter of using the words necessary to create that connection. Now, you can never know, but Toni Morrison was fond of saying that sort of, you can't know because everyone's different. There's no general reader. That person doesn't exist. She's like, but you have to write strategically, she would say. I had the good fortune of working with her for some time when I was a student. She's like, you have to write strategically. Of course, there's no imaginary perfect reader, but you have to sort of make a good guess at what you think readers will assume, what their suppositions will be, what their mental shortcuts might be, what will seem logical to them and what will seem illogical. And then you use all of that against them to bring them to some place they didn't anticipate going in the first place. That's what you do. And so your style for me, again, has to, must, these are highly subjective, and this is just me. And I'm not really that important. But for me at least, yeah, you have to make a guess. You have to game it a little bit. And you game it by being a good reader and reading a lot. And you game it by by being a good thinker, you know? You game it by paying attention. And then you can sort of pitch the style in relation to your subject and in relation to potential readers in a way that sort of creates a different and better kind of glitter bomb, you know? Not of words, but of meaning, I guess. But we're often wrong. Like, I thought I was doing that with my second novel, and the world did not agree. You know? They're like, whatever, not interested. But I think my second novel, I was too in love with Cormac McCarthy at that time of my life. No, I was. I couldn't, he was in my head. And I was in love with him. Not him. He's not my type.
Okay. I was sort of interested in the architecture in your head, how you have the story in your head. I sort of pictured scaffolding. Is that really sort of, do you have a specific idea in mind where you create that architecture, or is it just sort of like those 3 points you talked about?
No, I mean, in general, you mean, like general process? I don't. Like, I'm not really very programmatic, but I'll start a project thinking there's some, fiction being different than nonfiction. With nonfiction, I kind of have a mission, like I have a goal. Like I want to have a certain effect. I want to change something. You know, with novels, it's a little different. So just speaking about novels, a character or a situation or an idea or a feeling will occur to me, I guess. And then over time, more stuff will accrete around it. It's sort of, you know, the beginnings of some sort of planetary thing, and just sort of stuff accretes eventually until I have enough to think I have a story. And that's all very early. That's just when I'm driving or, you know, going to Jujitsu or something. I don't know, you know? And I thought everyone was like this, but I guess not everyone is like this. That I'm a kind of a spatial thinker. Like, I can see things in my head in 3 dimensions. So I can make halfway decent furniture without any kind of plan. My younger brother is much better at this kind of thinking than I am, and he makes much better furniture than I do. It's a boss couch, man. Yeah. But I think he knows what I mean. Like, you can turn it around in your head. You can see it from underneath and above and behind. You have a sense of it, and you know, and it's a solid structure with dimensions and perspectives, and I can sort of spin it. And I feel that that's how plots work for me. That's how stories and novels work for me. I can, after a certain point of initial genesis, I'll have it in my head. I'm like, okay, I know how I can see it from all the angles, and then I just need to sort of sit down and write it. But I don't think everyone works like that. I thought everyone did. Like, can't you see it? This is my big objection with Jonathan Franzen. Not my biggest objection. There are many reasons to object, but to give him some credit, like he's got a kind of psychological insight. Like, his characters are really believable, and he's really good at creating complicated, nuanced characters with a kind of psychological texture, which I can't do. I am really impressed by. But he's fatal for a couple different reasons. One is that he creates these characters with these incredibly awesome flaws and sets them up to fail, and he rescues them all at the end. Always. And I'm like, you can't have a character that flawed and it will work out for them. So he doesn't like to kill his darlings. That's a problem. And then he has no architectural sense at all. So 2/3 of the way through or 3/4 of the way through any Jonathan Franzen novel, he doesn't know what to do, so he brings in tanks or something. He did. There were tanks. Because he doesn't know what else to do. Because he's not a good architect. So yeah, good question. But
so it sounds like you start with, one of the things you said is that you have the counter thesis. Is that the starting point, or do you arrive at the counter thesis?
Well, that was the starting point for this book.
Okay.
That was not the starting point for Res Life. But maybe not. Maybe sort of a starting point for me is always sort of speculative. Like, what if we see it the opposite way? What if we turn this upside down? So maybe you're right and I'm wrong. And in the tradition of my people. I've always been oppositional. Anyone in my family can tell you that. You know, I've just, ever since my traumatic brain injury, I'm not even joking, by the way. And so that is a starting place for me. I'm like, okay, what if it's this opposite way? What if instead of less, we think of more? What if, not the end, but the beginning. What if, and that's maybe you're right. That's a pretty generative first step for me often. And I think when I was younger, it got me in trouble because I think that the opposite is sufficient. That rejection is itself some sort of creative act. Like, no, not you, not this. And that's an initial, very small step to say, well, what if it's this other way? And then to try and generate and to think generatively as opposed to destructively. When I was a student, I just thought destructively. I'm going to take apart your theory. I'm going to take apart your approach. I'm going to take apart, And as I've gotten hopefully more mature, I've been able to sort of not rest there when I'm like, what about the opposite thing? And then I can start seeing sort of what opportunities and avenues and that can generate. So I'm not just, I'm not just in attack mode, I guess. That's a really good observation. Now I have to think about myself. So thank you for that.
Please give David a warm
Thank you,
round
guys.
of applause.
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.